welcome to the Hobby Graveyard, the place where all my unfinished or abandoned projects are buried. In today's video, we'll be looking at the fantastic Sir Lancerot bust from Spira Mirabilis, or Lucas Pina as you may know him. Specifically, we'll be looking at doing some non-metallic metals. Now there are lots of metallic areas, as indicated onto the bust, such as the bracer, the shoulder pad, the helmet, even his knee pads on either side. Now, all of that is particularly ornate, and while I would love to cover them all in one video, this video is already long enough. So just for today, we'll be looking at his shoulder pad, specifically the one facing the camera at the moment. Now you'll notice that I've already blocked in quite a lot of his skin, and this is only a base coat and we'll go into it in future videos. But let's get started with some non-metallics. Now we begin with a base coat of Dark Sea Ben from Monument Hobbies and Coal Black, also from Monument Hobbies. You can see them arrayed on my desk behind the miniature. Now the reason why we use Coal Black mixed in with it is to desaturate it, that is to say, take some of the colour out of it. There's probably a more scientific definition of it, but if you want a basic one, that's what I always go with. Now, Dark Sea Ben is a little desaturated as it is anyway, but having a black just helps to also darken it down so we can use Dark Sea Ben if we need to glaze over things later. I'm applying it in a thin layer, or more like a wash I suppose. This is for two reasons. One, it means that some of the paint will wash into some of the recesses, and as Lucas Pina's work generally has a lot of micro details into it, this just means that I can see them a little clearer when I'm painting. Should also mean they appear a little better on camera. But it also means that I don't build up any unnecessary texture or brush strokes at this point. Now I'm sure you all know how to base coat, so I won't go over all of the finer details, so we'll skip forward a little to once I'd built up a nice opaque layer over that. There we go, as if by magic it's done. Now, the key thing with any metallic or non-metallic piece of work is to make sure that your lights are in the right place, and I'll illustrate that here with just adding a little bit of water to the surface of the miniature. Using the fancy Chimera size 2 brush, we can see that we have its almost spherical surface here, or like a sort of stretched circle, I suppose you could say. And we want our main light to be coming just here, where I'm dabbing the water on there. Now, as you can see, I'm painting this into roughly a circular shape, because really we can make the shape as what we ever want to be. But then we also want to focus on the edges as well. One thing to remember is that metallics will often reflect a lot of light at the edges. Now, because there is a slight taper to it, we can extend it over here, but we also can see that we're leaving some shadows in there as well. We'll also add a little to the reverse side as well, because otherwise having too much of it in shadow would look a bit bland. When it comes to painting non-metallics specifically, there are many recipes that you can use. As I've said, in this case we'll be using Dark Sea Ben from Monument Hobbies, created by Ben Comets, and of course Coal Black, their standard black that exists, although I know there is a satin black in the Adepticon set. But these work well as a base coat, and you can use them as a multitude of options to go with, and Dark Sea Ben is very nice, and it's also possibly my favourite colour for using for non-metallics. But when it comes to highlighting, this is where you can start to make some more stylistic choices yourself. In the case of our pig, or indeed our goblin in this case, I want to have a little bit of green in there, just predominantly to contrast the fact that the pig is going to be a large element to the piece. So we're using dark yellow-green, again from Monument Hobbies, as a little bit of an extra tone to the mix. Now we're adding this in purely as a highlight colour. It won't really be too noticeable by the time we're done, but it'll help to tone stuff just for our frame of our highlights and indeed some of the early steps that we go for. And as I've said before, I'm using the Chimera size 2 chisel-headed brush. They are very nice to use. If you can get your hands on them, do have a go with them, but they're not the cheapest of brushes. Don't feel like you have to use the same brushes as I am. Simply use the ones that you've got, that you're comfortable with, that you know are reliable. If you've got them, by all means have a go, but if not, you don't have to. Now, in terms of colour schemes, there is of course Payne's Grey from the Vince Venturella set. It's a lovely colour to use with non-metallics, and I was considering using it in this case. I may use it again later. It's again a nice dark blue, but in this case I just wanted to have that nice sort of turquoise of Dark Sea Ben. Then it comes to the question of what do we add to it to make it brighter. Now, with non-metallics, brightness is good. And I like to use dark ivory and bright ivory as my key things to add to my mixes. Now, dark ivory, being, as it says in the name, being that little bit darker, is good to build up into your midtones, and then you can use bright ivory for your very, very bright points. You could also use ice yellow being a lovely colour for the majority of them, and available from most good paint brands, and some dodgy ones. Now, the reason why we're not using ice yellow in this case is because it has a little bit of blue into it. You wouldn't notice from looking at it, and then it looks like a fairly off-white with a little bit of yellow to it. Alternatively, we could use white blue from, again, the Vince Venturella set. It's a lovely tone, but it is a little bit bright for what I want to go for. And while we can darken it down with some mixes, in my opinion, dark ivory will work very nicely with them bright ivory for the highlights, predominantly because they have got some yellow to them, so we can use it to reflect the sun. Now, back to our goblin. This next step is we're going to be creating what I like to call the frame for our highlights, using the mixture of our base tone mix, as listed before, a bit of dark ivory and a bit of dark yellow-green, in roughly a 3:1:1 recipe. Now, it's important to remember that I mix colours by eye, not necessarily in their scientific standard measurements, mainly because this is impossible, but also because in the grip of painting, you generally don't notice these things. As you can see onto the video, this is a fairly desaturated green-blue, little bit of turquoise with some brightness to it. But in terms of colour choice, go for whichever you like. You can mix it however you want to, as long as it's brighter than your base tone. But the key thing here is what we're doing with the paint, and this is, as I've said, building up the frame of our highlights. If you consider the frame of a painting, it is the outline that you will normally hang a larger print into it, or indeed, if you're lucky enough, the painting itself. For non-metallics, we can consider the frame as the outline to all of our highlights. This gives us a boundary for it between our shadows. It also means that we have a nice demarcation between our shadows and our midpoints. That just helps us for when we're planning stuff out at the moment. Now, we're using fairly thin paint, and this is what people refer to as a sketch. This is thin paint applied very loosely, not particularly neatly, just so we can see roughly what we're doing, get an idea into our heads, and compare whether it matches what we want to create at the end. Now, unfortunately, I have cut off a little of the painting process by going out of frame on the camera. My apologies for that. I'll make sure not to do it again in future videos. But you can see that I'm just applying the paint very loosely around the area, letting it dry, letting it just see where we're going, not wondering or sort of bothering really about the fact that I'm building up all of these lines of brush strokes, or indeed the splodginess of the paint, or the tide marks just from where it has gone thin. Now, it is drying quite quickly because it's quite a warm night here in the UK, but if you need to, feel free to just dry each layer with a hairdryer, or because it's resin, you can use a heat gun if you're careful. Now, you can see just from here that we have still some of our shadows left, but we have a fairly circular highlight with a few sort of stray edges that we can use to plan where the rest of our highlights go. At this point, I'm just applying another layer so that I can start to bring this up into it being opaque. I'm also checking to see, are there areas where perhaps the shape of what I've painted isn't necessarily the right, shape. Maybe it needs a little bit more refinement. Maybe there's some areas that I think, this might look good, having some nice dramatic shadows there. But you'll notice that I'm also paying careful attention to outline everything at the edges. The shoulder pad itself does have a taper. I'm sure there's an actual armourer's name for this, I just don't know what it is. Now, by blocking in the edges here, it doesn't show too much, but again, it just is a nice reminder and an aid to memory when we're painting some of our brighter highlights, in order to make sure that we do highlight them, that they're not just left in this darker midtone. Now, as you can see from the reverse, I'm highlighting the edge again and blocking in the colour, but remaining the video out of focus so that you can't really see it. It will get better, I promise. And you can see here that because where my actual painting light is reflecting off the miniature, we can see that there is a tiny, I believe it's a specular highlight just towards the top by his ear. So we'll paint that in. having a nice blob of a highlight to follow, and indeed just the natural light hitting into us, can sometimes be the best inspiration. I'm also at this point adding in a few under highlights to the underside of the shoulder pad. Now this could be light reflecting off his tunic underneath it, could be light reflecting off the ground, maybe it's like even reflecting off his bracer that he's got, we don't know, and we'll come back to it a bit later. But also notice that I'm not really caring about whether I'm applying it, but I am dragging the brush towards where I want the brightest point to be. You're going from the tip of the brush at the start of the brush stroke, and then using the belly of the brush close to the ferrule, that's the metal bit, towards the end. Now the reason I do this is because when you put the brush onto the model, where you remove the brush, again, that is where most of the pigment is deposited. Where you start your brush stroke, you won't generally have too much. It'll be a mixture of paint and water, and even some medium if you're using thinner paint. Now because of this, you can start to blend some of your colours just on the brush, and you'll notice this in future sections as I'm going through, that you'll be able to see where the pigment is perhaps a little sparser, and indeed where I start to blend it just on there. But as a general rule of thumb, try to make sure that you're always dragging the paintbrush towards where you want your brighter point to be, not towards where you want your shadows to be, unless you're glazing, but we'll do that a bit later. Here you can see that things are starting to dry, we have our clear demarcations, and we're going into the next blob of highlights, let's say. As you can see, this time we're getting a little bit brighter again, due to the addition of some more dark ivory and a little bit more dark yellow-green. Now you'll notice that all I'm doing is adding colours to our previous mix. I don't generally ever add another colour in unless I want to tint it or indeed adjust the way that I wish to paint. And this is normally because I've noticed that I've done something wrong, I don't necessarily like it anymore, or I've got a different idea for where I want to take the colour scheme. In this case, I'm using a wet palette, and that means that I can keep all of my mixes nice and fresh as I'm painting the rest of the shoulder pad in this case, or indeed the rest of the miniature if it's something a bit smaller. If you're not using a wet palette, I highly recommend either buying one or making one yourself. There are many good hobby videos out there on how to make one. You may have seen them already, but you'll notice a difference in your painting immediately. You can also buy them from all good hobby shops, and I think you can even get them on Amazon if you want. Now, for our goblin specifically, you can see that the lights are starting to come in, but it's not shining, there's no sheen to it necessarily. But I'm still marking out where our highlights are going to go with the edges, and indeed that main spherical or circular highlight just into there under his ear where I'm painting at the moment. And here you can notice that once again I'm moving the brush towards the middle of where I want my lights to be, and of course taking it off in that point where the light is going to be brightest, and also marking out the edges. As I said before, this may not necessarily make it look more metallic, but again it's an aid to memory in order to remember to do it. It'll also help with blending a little bit later. Now when we get to this point, another reason that I'm not having painted too much of it off camera, one is that I want you to see the entire process, but also you'll notice that the edge of that shoulder pad is very close to his ear, and it's very, very easy to stain other areas of the model as you're doing this thing, especially if you're using a large brush. Now with the Chimera brushes, and while I'm not sponsored by them or anything to that degree, it is quite nice that you can taper them, you can use the tip of the brush while maintaining a lot of paint into the ferrule. And here we are returning to the back of the miniature, and we're moving that circular highlight around, we're pulling it towards the back of the miniature, following the shape of the shoulder pad. Annoyingly, I have cut it off on the camera there, but I'm sure you get the idea. Now, one thing that you may notice me doing occasionally is that I will just draw lines with the tip of the brush and only using the tip. This is in order to build up texture onto our brush strokes, and you can see me there just filling in some areas of the underside of the shoulder pad as well. Now I like to build up texture with the mid-tones and indeed at this sketching stage, because when we get to a step later on you'll see that I tint the entire area a different green in order to balance it and add in a few different tones there as well. But as you're just glazing over it and we're never fully painting over stuff, all of that texture and really all of that, let's say, data to the eye is still visible, and it can still add a story or indeed just an extra bit of texture to the miniature. And so if you are, when you're planning out your highlights or doing anything like that, do just consider adding some in. They don't have to be perfect, you can neaten them up later, but at this stage you've not really got anything to lose. You can see me just extending the highlight there, pulling it down into that shoulder pad in order to follow the natural lines and shape of the shoulder pad, but not covering up all of the shadow. Well, maybe not all of it. There is still some following, but I will have to re-establish it later. It's also looking fairly similar to our skin, just in terms of tone. And while this was completely unintentional, it's probably something that I should have noticed, considering they're using basically the same paints. And here you can see that I'm just blocking in some of those areas that I added in the second pass with the highlights, because as I was adding a brighter colour over a darker one and using thin paint, it was a little bit patchy and adding in some more of that texture that I spoke about earlier. And I'm using a slightly thicker paint here, more towards a standard layer consistency as opposed to the thin layers we normally do at this stage. And here you can see I'm just using the tip of the brush to add in some smaller scratches and smaller textured areas. For some of the areas that are close to other sections, I do have to move it a little bit closer to me so that I can see it, so apologies once again that not all of it is visible. I am getting better at it, and hopefully that won't happen in future videos. And as I said before, I have covered up most of our shadows, and one of the key other aspects of non-metallics is having a nice balance between your shadows and your light. And so, going back to our previous mixes, specifically our base tone mix and indeed our darker highlight mix, I suppose that's slightly paradoxical, but I'm sure you can tell what I mean. And here we're just reapplying those shadows, or re-establishing them, I suppose I should say, back onto the shoulder pad. Again, this is a sketching stage, but this is more just to see that all of our shadows are in the right place, we know where we're going, we know roughly what the shape of it is, and it'll just make our life so much easier later on. And here you can see I'm reapplying our highlights once again, because I added too much shadow. At this stage, it's alright to go back and forth over what you're doing, and indeed, areas that you perhaps aren't too pleased with, areas that you just want to have another go at, it's absolutely fine to continue to go over them until you are happy. It's one of the great bonuses of sketching. And here you can see perhaps a bit clearer example of that idea of building up texture. The lines are following the shape of the shoulder pad, they are moving with the lines and the outline, but I'm also using them to show that where the shadows are, where it's bent, where there's some texture to it. It's still a slightly yellowy green mass at the moment, but I promise it will get shinier and more metallic later on. And as you can see there, my camera's autofocus decided that the ear needed a little box around it, so there you go, have something to show where the paintbrush is going to go. Now that things are drying, you can start to see that there is a little more colour there. I had already applied a highlight, but it wasn't bright enough. But we're going even brighter now, adding in more dark ivory. There you can see just on the tip of the brush. And we're applying it in that nice circular highlight that we have again, straight into the middle, establishing our brightest point and then working outwards from there. Now, as we're getting into some brighter highlights, I like to sort of paint them in lines. It's sort of like I suppose a star shape would work. And this just means that all of our brushstrokes point towards the brightest point, as I've said frequently before, and you're probably sick of me saying, but it also means that as we can move the brush towards it, we can blend them again a bit later. You see me just establishing the edge highlights. Now it's looking a little bit more metallic, perhaps slightly green and gungy, which might work if that's what you're doing. It could work for, say, a Nurgle miniature on a smaller scale, just to make it look slightly diseased. In this case, I sort of want him to look a bit more I suppose regal would be one word. He is a knight, or at least I believe the story is that he believes he's a knight. The lance isn't broken, it is shortened for the sake of being able to get to his enemies quicker so they can see him. And indeed his noble steed will carry him into battle along with his willing squire. May not necessarily be true, but it's a nice story, and he believes it. And he's got the lance, so we're going to believe him. Here you can see that I'm just applying the edge highlights again, not going over the areas that are still drying because this can tear up layers of paint. At this stage I'm also now trying to deliberately build up some of our brush strokes. I'm still sketching, but I do want some of them to remain visible. And so I'm being a little bit more careful with where I'm moving the brush, being a little bit more deliberate with how I'm aiming the brush, which direction I'm moving it. Now again, one of the bonuses of using these Chimera ones is because it is a sort of arrowhead, you can use the side of the brush in order to help with these brush strokes, but if you're just using a standard one, you may just wish to hold the brush slightly differently so you're employing more of the tip of the brush rather than the side. This is also useful if you're doing edge highlights as well. You may be inclined to use the flat or the edge of the brush when you're doing your edge highlights, but you can sometimes get a thin line of paint onto lower details if you do that. So if you can use the brush tip of the brush, you can just have a little bit more control. If you've perhaps not got the best brush control in the world, don't worry, this will all just come with practice, but you may just wish to have a smaller amount of paint just on the tip of the brush and move it very carefully around the edge, building up the layers quite slowly. And here you can see me just going back into the reverse of the miniature and that edge, which I wasn't too happy with at this stage, and I thought that it could do with perhaps a few more shiny areas just so that the front doesn't overshadow it, I suppose. You'll also notice that I've added a small band where the shoulder pad bends slightly. This is useful in order to show that there is a bend into the metal, because there is one modelled onto it, but it also helps to separate our shadows and to show reflected light. So you notice we've got our sort of dark spot on the spherical bit of it, and then as the edge pulls out, we've got another shadow there separated by that line of highlight, which is next to where I'm painting at the moment, and possibly painting over the top of. Now the reason why these two are separated is because we can imagine, while it is a trough, let's say, we can sort of imagine it like the peak of a mountain. That will be where the light would hit it the brightest, and there would be shadow either side. Now because it is a indentation there would be shadow either side just to help show that it is metallic. This becomes a bit more easy to understand as we get into a brighter highlight and it doesn't look like a bit of a off-yellow, off-white smudge. Now I think we can all agree that in this case with the reverse of the minute I may have got a bit overboard in establishing that highlight, and the front is perhaps a bit more dramatic. And we can start to see where some more light is coming in. My camera wants to focus onto the squire there, but unfortunately that is saved for another video. It will have to wait. And looking at it from the front, we can start to see a bit more where we want our lights to go, but they are focusing upon that main circular highlight towards the front. Oh, the camera's at it again. Now because I went a little bit overboard onto that light, I'm now going back with some of our previous mixes and adding in some transitions into the shadows. Now I'm not using the base tone per se, I'm just using a darker mid-tone in order to re-establish the transitions between our highlights and our midtones, or our brighter midtones and our darker midtones. Eventually I may go back and re-establish our shadows, perhaps after when it's not on video. In this case all I wanted to do was just make sure that the shadows were there, that the highlights were still there, but I wasn't losing any of that texture that I'd built up, and that's why I'm applying it predominantly in lines, moving to brush towards those shadowed areas, but focusing on the transition between the two, just to help blend it at this stage, but also so there's not any hard lines or tide marks. Now, if you were doing this for, say, a tabletop piece and you're doing it on Warhammer or something that's a bit more of a gaming piece that you know you're going to consistently be using, you may not want to go any further, or if you got for a style or indeed a palette choice that you want to go for that is perhaps a bit more battered or diseased or just, I suppose, a bit more beaten up, you could stop here entirely. But here you can see that I'm just re-establishing those edges that had got perhaps a little bit lost or that I'd forgotten to do. Again, aid to memory, very useful. But in this case, I'm reapplying them so that I have that sharp and indeed bright edge towards the front. It also helps the camera pick it up because it sometimes gets a bit confused with the zenithal highlight that I had applied over the primer. In case you were wondering, the primer is Scale 75 airbrush primer, the mattest primer that I know of, and then with a zenithal of Tamiya flat white. If you are using Tamiya, do remember to use Tamiya thinners. This was a trick that I learned from Cult of Paint and the great Andy Wardle and Henry Steele. And here, as the layers are drying, you can start to see where the highlights are, the shadows are, where our transitions are going, and that there's a nice amount of texture. Now, it was at this point that I'd noticed that it was still separated from the skin, but it was still perhaps a bit muddy, and I didn't like it too much. And here we have a little trick. Using transparent green from Monument Hobbies, we can start to tint it, or not so much start to, we can just paint over the entire area, and that's precisely what I did. Using a very thin glaze, so this is predominantly water with a little bit of paint in, we just paint over the entire shoulder pad. Now you may question as to why we're doing this, because we've just spent all of that time painting, marking all of these areas, doing all of that mixing, and yeah, it can feel a bit strange to do this, but honestly it will help improve everything. Not only does it add a slightly different tone, but not adding to the palette so much, but it also helps to blend some of these areas together. Now, rather helpfully, I have left this off focus so you can't see it, but there we go, I'm learning at this stage. Now that we have tinted this area, we can start to be perhaps a little bit more precise with how we go about adding and reapplying our highlights. The first thing that we will do is use a smaller brush, and in this case I use the Chimera size 1. It looks like a more traditional brush. This will look like anything that you can buy from a Games Workshop, from Raphael, Winsor & Newton, Artis Opus, or just any of the ones that you can get nice and cheap on Amazon if you prefer. Again, the best brush is the one that you own. Now here you can see me re-establishing some of the darker midtones that I was working with before. This is done with a mixture of the original base tone mix, so dark sea Ben, black, a little bit of dark ivory, and a tiny touch of dark yellow green. Only this time I'm adding in a little touch of the transparent green as well, predominantly to tint it, but also so that I can add in some of those texture lines that I'd done before by painting them deliberately in, and hopefully remembering to keep them in focus and on the screen. Now, because we're reapplying the shadows, this is where we can really start to show and deliberately place where we want our shadows to be, how we're going to play with the shape of the piece, and indeed where these texture lines are going to show up. Now, because I want to do the pins that are keeping it fixed to his armour in a different colour and possibly add a bit of grime and rust to them, I'm not painting them at the moment, but I do want them to be some shadow around them. So in this case, I'm just building up those areas, reapplying those darker tones around them so that they are separated from the highlights. Again, this is a fairly slow but deliberate process. We are deliberately using a smaller brush so that we have more control over where we're drawing our textures, and we're going over the areas that we've painted before, now having tinted them, in order to really show off where we want to do it, have a lot more control over them. But once we're happy with where we've got the shadow tones, and indeed the shadows in general, we can start to apply our newly tinted highlight colours, I suppose. This is transparent green, the base tone mix, with a little bit more dark ivory. Note, we're not adding any more dark yellow green at this point. This is because that was mainly used into the skin, and I found that it was just making it a little bit too close to it. So instead, we are going straight for dark ivory, just into separate them a little bit more and make it brighter a little bit quicker. And here you can see that I am applying those textures. I'm drawing thin lines, dragging the brush towards where I want my highlights to go. And this is in a sort of almost sort of frantic motion, I suppose, pulling the paint towards those center lines, adding in those textures, just drawing over the transitions in order to feather them out. This will not only help with blending, but it also means that we can build up that lovely, lovely texture that I do keep going on about. See that where we're getting that sort of slightly tapered edge, the texture is being built up to show that it looks like it could have scratches. It might just be a texture onto the metal from where it's been brushed, but by bringing that in now, it is establishing it nice and early, so when we blend over the top, it will still be there. Again, we're keeping all of that visual data. Same with the reverse of the miniature, where I'm drawing them all of those lines in to follow the shape of the shoulder pad itself. However, for the circular highlight into the middle, we can't really draw lines onto those because it's a circle, but we can draw lines around it. We can follow the shape of it, move them around, and then when we glaze over the top, they will still be there. It will still follow the shape of it. But we can just still put a blob into the middle of that area with paint in order to show that that is where the brightest point is. Once we've got those applied, we can go even brighter. And here is where we can start to see that sudden jump into it looking slightly metallic. Now I say slightly, and I am hedging my words there, because non-metallics is one of those processes that you really have to trust that you're painting. It won't look metallic until it is very nearly done. And even then, it may still trick you. But for this highlight mix, we're using our previous mix, plus more dark ivory. Not very helpful. I've not provided a reference or indeed a ratio there. Play it by eye. If it looks brighter than your previous tone and it's looking a bit more like pure dark ivory, you're on the right track. If it's still looking perhaps a bit more green, or you're getting some traces of blue, paint that on anyway, but then add some more dark ivory onto your next layer. As with all of the previous layers, we're starting by establishing that main circular or sort of dot highlight into the middle there, but then we're pulling the paint around, moving it in, pushing it more towards where the I suppose the shoulder pad is tapered, it's angled, or it may have been beaten up. Again, establishes texture, but it also helps to just sell that metallic effect. The other thing that we're doing is that we're keeping our highlights in line with each other. Now here you can see that I'm just painting it on towards that tapered edge, applying that highlight again that I was explaining earlier, but you'll notice that we can follow a line from that point of highlight just on the band, I suppose we'll call it, but it follows in line with the main specular or circular highlight that we have on the shoulder pad. This helps to again sell it as being metallic because it shows that the sun is staying in one place. If you want to have multiple light sources, you can apply them all in different areas, but fundamentally light will hit metal in a straight line because light likes travelling in straight lines. Or so physics says anyway. Next we come to re-establish our edge highlights. We're painting them on, keeping them nice and sharp, again with the same tone as we've used for our highlights. We want them to be nice and bright. As I've said at the start, when we have a nice metallic area, the light will collect at the edges. Now for that sort of band, I suppose, I'm not sure what the name of it is. I probably should have looked it up before I started recording the voiceover, but I didn't. But for the band, you can see that I have added a line that goes into the shadows pointing up towards the pin. Now that helps to show that it is curved, but it also just adds that nice visual flair to it. And those sorts of things help to separate your paint job from everybody else's. Here we're just expanding that circular highlight into there and moving towards the reverse of the miniature, where we'll do pretty much exactly the same thing as before. Here you'll notice that I'm applying slightly thinner paint again, so we may get a few tide marks, but I'm pushing the paint towards where I want the brighter points to be, still moving it in those lines, following the shape of the shoulder pad, as you're probably sick of me saying. But doing that, again, blends it onto the miniature as I'm painting. You can see as it's drying, those tide marks and indeed paint brushstrokes are sort of dissolving amongst the rest of it, and you'll probably only be able to see when I zoom in again. We'll cover them up later with some glazing and some work onto the transitions, but it just makes our life a little bit easier. Same with when I'm doing the one sort of look up towards his back, I suppose. And if I'd included it onto the camera, you can see me then just going back to the edge as I'm reapplying here. Having nice crisp edge highlights and doing them early really does save time later on, because if you build up your edge highlights with each of your consistent tones, that will blend it, even just as you're painting it along. If you miss areas, it can be areas in shadow, could be sort of little scratches, scuffs, anything like that. It builds up texture. But areas that are smaller, you don't have to worry too much about blending them together, because your eye won't be able to see them. We can only really see them when we take pictures, and even then that's because phones or DSLRs or just any camera that you may have, even a video camera I suppose, will just pick up on different things that the eye doesn't. And so if you can't see it in the hand and your camera can, I wouldn't worry about it. If you're happy with it as it looks onto the hand, yeah, the camera may be focusing. It could be the colour of the background that you've got, the light that you've got, any other colours that you just haven't painted yet. One of the reasons why we are not going into fully bright highlights on this section is because we've still got a lot of the white zenithal showing, and this can in fact trick the eye as you're painting. You'll notice that perhaps your highlights aren't as bright as they could be, and you might go over the top with your highlights. This is quite hard to really solve, and you will end up having to repaint quite a lot of the area if you do this. It's not impossible, and sometimes it can work really well, but just at this stage we're erring on the side of caution. Not only because I'm recording a video of it and I don't want to have to reshoot stuff, but also because it means that we can have a final look over where we'll do sort of like a tidying up or fixing stage towards the end, because there will no doubt be things that I've missed, things that I need to adjust, and these are useful parts of the painting process. Here you can see I'm just adding in that circular highlight, connecting the two from the front and the back, but putting it over the shadow. Now, because I'm applying a lighter paint, it doesn't blend in as well as perhaps all of the others that I'm applied over those consistent layers, and as it's going straight over the shadow, it's a bit more stark. This I don't really mind about, because it will help to build up those nice texture lines that I've said before, but it's also something that I'll be glazing over anyway, so it doesn't really matter at this stage. Here we're just reapplying some of those highlights, making them opaque, just removing any tide marks or just unnecessary transition lines that we've got in order to make life easier. And my camera's deciding that, well, my hand was a face there for a second. It must have a mind of its own. And with those highlights nice and established, and as we zoom out, it's starting to look a lot more metallic. And again, if you're doing a tabletop piece and you want some nice dramatic changes, you could leave it here, but because this is for display, we're not. And we're getting into the more minutiae, the smaller details of the piece. using our previous mix, but this time adding in bright ivory in a 1-to-1 mix. This will look very, very bright, almost like pure bright ivory. With this, we are applying our nice bright highlights. This is where we're getting some shine to it. And here is where you'll have your make or break test of non-metallics. Provided all has gone well, and I'm sure it has, by applying these highlights, everything will suddenly start to make sense. If it doesn't, don't worry. We'll be doing some glazing, adjusting, and you can always go back to this step when you get there. But you'll notice that we've also gone down into a smaller brush. This is the 00, again from Chimera. Has a nice sharp tip to it, and while I hadn't used it before, I'll probably use it again. They're rather nice sets. But here you can see that I am moving the brush from one side first, pushing again the paint towards where I want it to be brightest, and then going from the other direction and dragging the paint towards there, again building up these lines of texture. This helps with the texture, but it also means that we can start to blend on the brush and onto the miniature, so we don't have to glaze later. We still will, just to smooth things over, but you can again save yourself some time. Here we are applying that point highlight again. I had applied it in the first time that I tried this, but unfortunately the paint was a little bit thin and it was drying onto the tip of the brush as I was painting, so I did have to go over these things a couple of times. Now, if you've got exceptionally good brush control, you could do this with a larger brush and you could still get the same effect and probably get it done a lot quicker. Because I was on camera and, well, just because I wanted to try it out, I decided to go for the 00. And you'll notice now that I have applied a highlight by the pin of that bright tone. Now, this wasn't really built up with any of our mid-tones or previous highlights, but because it is a sudden stark change, and it is a very sudden change, this can help it to look metallic as well. It also helps to establish that there is perhaps a band around it and that it has got a little bit dented, or maybe it's just always been like that. However, the story that I want to tell with this miniature is that it could be suggested that all of his armour pieces, and indeed those that his squire is wearing, he has, let's say, borrowed, fully intending to give them back, other pieces of armour from other knights that he has maybe met in battle, dismounted, beaten in a duel via purely noble circumstances, certainly not stolen them, definitely not. But because of that, it does also give me the option to mean that we can have some stranger colours if we want to. I may not, but that's all part of the painting process. But if I wanted to suddenly do some gold bits, add some freehand just to put some sort of, I don't know, heraldic markings onto them, that will be a little fun project. Gives another sort of nice visual piece to have a look at, but just means that we can keep the viewer's interest to it as well, and helps with a bit of storytelling, which is never a bad thing. Much like me, when I was recording, you can probably see that I made a mistake there. I've added a little bit too much paint to the miniature and made that line a bit too thick. This is something that I will have to adjust later on, and it also means that we've got a line pointing at the pin that is fixing his armour to, and I don't really like that. Having some more subtle lines to draw the eye, they're alright, but having something direct eye just doesn't really work for me. But it does also give me a reason to show you about glazing. You You can also see that I've broken the line up there by having it that it curves around, not following the shape of the shoulder pad. When you paint yours, you obviously won't do that. Now here I'm just glazing and reapplying those shadows with our base tone, and this is very loose. This is more just going over the areas where you've perhaps taken away too much of the shadow, or you just need to correct areas where you've made mistakes, like I just have. Here we are just fixing that mistake. By glazing over these lines, we're not erasing them entirely, but we are pushing them back. In the way that sort of like Bob Ross used to do by adding in some trees or foothills to the painting. It just means that we have some perspective and some depth, and that's basically what we're doing with our metals. We're pushing all of those scratches and little dents back into the piece so they look like they are more subtle, they're smaller, they're not as stark as they could be. And from here, we can see in a slightly zoomed out view that we're getting nice and shiny, it's looking metallic, and it could pretty much be done. However, I am not too pleased with the way that it looks from the back, and so want to add in a few brighter points, re-establish those sort of slightly shiny areas, in order to just make sure that they're nice and smooth, everything's got a nice transition to it. There are also a few harsh lines, so the next sort of few minutes will predominantly be going in, fixing some mistakes, reapplying our highlights, doing all of that, just making sure that everything looks nice and shiny and nice and clean. If you want to go for a more beaten up look, you can skip forward a bit, but most of this will just be me going around the miniature, or the shoulder pad I should say, and just trying to fix some of the little mistakes that I may have made before, or reapplying the areas that have got lost when we want to apply the filter over the top of it, but also when I've been glazing. One thing to remember there is if you're glazing and you are fixing the mistakes, you may sometimes go a bit overboard on that and need to reapply the highlights that you've just glazed over. That does sound strange, but provided you make sure that your paint is thin, you can make sure that you do get that slightly thinner layer to be built up, because you'll then need to make sure that there is a layer of paint there for you to transition over with. At this point, it's looking nice and shiny. If we zoom out, there we are, we can see that it's looking more metallic, especially compared to the skin. We've got those nice curved areas. We can see that there is a lot of texture built up to it. There's still some things that I need to adjust about it, but I won't sort of make you suffer through them or watching me do them on camera, and I'll do them just for probably when we get to the end in that sort of little tidying up stage. Especially into that middle, I don't really like the central highlight there. It could be a bit brighter, but that's just something that I will do. And here we can just enhance our shadows a bit more using dark magenta, again from Monument. I think this is from the Ninjon set. Now in terms of contrast, transparent green and dark magenta are on other sides of the colour wheel, and so by mixing a little bit of black with the dark magenta and thinning it down to a glaze, we can add it to our shadows. And when the eye processes this, it will start to see these as much darker than just our dark sea blue and black mix that we'd used before. If we glaze this or apply it just into all of the shadows, or at least the deepest point that we want to be our shadows, we can just make sure that they are even darker and that they will just have that little bit of colour nuance to it as well. Now, I'm not ashamed to admit that I did make quite a few mistakes while I was doing this, as you can see me trying to erase them there. Unfortunately, because of how warm it was when I was painting this, I didn't get there in time, so we did have a tide mark left. In an attempt, in order to not have this again, I thought, well, we'll paint this in here again. Lo and behold, it happened once again. So here you can see that I'm just painting it into that shadow, and on any other night it probably would have been okay. And here I'm washing my brush and then just pulling the paint around, and it's probably because I've got a bit too much water onto the brush there, but I thought best to be a bit overcautious. Now as this is drying, this is causing some tide marks to appear, but because I'm feathering it out with water, they won't go over our highlights. But it does mean that I just need to apply another layer of glaze over the top in order to transition those out. This isn't a bad thing, it's an annoying part of the painting process, and while I wouldn't have necessarily liked to have had to do it, it means that these shadows are a bit more, I suppose, smoother, or just they can add a bit more nuance to the piece. That will mean that people can look at it, or to the trained eye will notice where I've made a mistake, but good on them for noticing. Other thing that I want to try with this miniature, that I have done a couple of times, is I want to do some cast shadows. That is to say, where the natural light would hit, where would a shadow naturally be cast onto other parts of the model. In this case, we have the ear of our goblin. Now it's very close to the shoulder pad, so it would cast a shadow. And so with this black and magenta mix, I'm just thinly glazing it on, painting in where that ear would be, and doing this over thin layers. This one didn't need to correct, so it came out alright. But you can just see that I'm applying it, letting it dry, then applying another, or you would be able to see if I made sure that it was always on camera. And here you can see me just correcting some of the mistakes that I made earlier, making sure that they are dry in between layers and giving it the time that it needs. those last few brushstrokes that, well, you would be able to see if I'd remembered to keep them in frame, we can call the shoulder pad pretty much done for the time being. It's not perhaps the neatest that we can go for, but I will go through it off camera just to tidy it up. Or if you want to see that, I'll leave it for a video towards the end. But as I zoom the camera out, we can see our lovely finished, nice bright shiny green shoulder pad. And I hope that you've enjoyed this video. Please subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment. This is the first video that you can see that I've made, so hopefully you've enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next one.